The void of the Kuiper Belt did not scream when the Xandari Armada arrived. It buckled. 5,000 warships carved from sentient iridescent crystal and powered by captured singularities tore through the fabric of space-time. They materialized in a perfect geometric formation, a shimmering net of death cast over the outermost edge of the solar system. At the center of the formation sat the Eternal Spire, a dreadnought 5 miles long. High Admiral Valerius stood on the command bridge, his 4 golden eyes scanning the tactical holosphere. For 3 centuries, the Xandari had expanded, consuming empires that had lasted millennia. They had heard the whispers of Sol, the Forbidden System, the Quarantined Zone, but they saw only a yellow dwarf star and a handful of unremarkable planets. Valerius asked for a status report, his voice a melodic chime that hid a predatory edge. The bridge servant replied that the system scan was complete and thermal signatures were negligible. No defensive platforms had been detected. The third planet, Earth, remained silent. It appeared to be a primitive world, entirely unaware of the shadow falling upon them. Valerius felt a ripple of satisfaction. The Galactic Council had long maintained that humanity was an existential threat, keeping the system behind a veil of ancient treaties. But looking at the cold, lonely ball of ice known as Pluto, Valerius saw only an easy conquest. He mused that the Council was old and fearful, mistaking human stubbornness for power. He ordered the orbital lances to be prepared, intending to begin the conquest with the frozen outpost. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the melodic hum of the bridge. It was a deep, organic, and steady thump. The sound was coming from every speaker, every terminal, and every neural link across the entire 5,000-ship fleet. Valerius demanded the source be located, his scales flushing a warning crimson. The servant reported that the signal originated from a single unshielded terminal floating 3 kilometers off their starboard bow. It was a primitive broadcast using low-frequency radio waves. The tactical holosphere zoomed in on a tiny, blocky piece of metal, no larger than a human trunk, drifting in the shadow of the dreadnought. It looked like scrap metal held together by welds and hope. On its singular screen, a green line pulsed in perfect synchronization with the sound. Valerius whispered that it was a heartbeat, a strange instinct of fear prickling his spine. Beneath the pulsing green line, a series of neon red digits began to count down. 60, 59, 58. The tactical officer reported that the signal was broadcasting a short message in Galactic Standard. Valerius leaned in as the letters scrolled across the main screen. The message welcomed them to the cage and informed them they had 60 seconds to leave before humanity stopped being polite. Valerius let out a chilling laugh. He questioned why they would threaten his armada with a clock or a heartbeat. He ordered the terminal destroyed and the fleet to advance, convinced that the galaxy had been terrified of a ghost. A beam of pure concentrated starlight shot from the Eternal Spire, vaporizing the tiny terminal instantly. The heartbeat sound cut off into a deafening silence. The red numbers vanished. Valerius turned back to his bridge, ready to give the order for the grand assault. But the silence did not last. Across the fleet, the sensor alarms began to wail in a frequency of total panic. The servant shrieked for the Admiral to look at Pluto. The dwarf planet was no longer dark. Lines of white-hot energy were erupting across its surface, forming a perfect, terrifying geometric pattern. The planet was not breaking apart, it was opening. Inside the core of the planet, something massive and metallic began to rotate. The vanished screens were suddenly replaced by a single word flashing in the mind of every Xandari officer. Commencing. The ship's AI screamed as it detected a kinetic signature originating from the Kuiper Belt itself. 10,000 asteroids had just broken their orbits, and they were all accelerating toward the fleet at 10% the speed of light. Valerius watched in horror as the first mountain-sized rock obliterated a cruiser in a single, silent flash. He realized then that the heartbeat had not been a warning for humanity. It was the only thing that had been holding them back. And now the heart had stopped. The first strike was not an explosion, it was a deletion. A chunk of nickel iron the size of a human ground car, accelerated to 10% of the speed of light, struck the Xandari heavy cruiser, Radiant Dawn. The ship's crystalline shields, designed to refract high-energy plasma and disperse thermal heat, offered as much resistance as a spiderweb to a falling hammer. Physics, cold and indifferent, dictated the outcome. The asteroid did not stop. It passed through the ship's bow, through the singularity core, and out the stern in less than a microsecond. The Radiant Dawn did not break apart. It simply transitioned into a cloud of glowing atoms. On the bridge of the Eternal Spire, High Admiral Valerius felt the deck shudder as the shockwaves of localized gravity collapses rippled through the fleet. His tactical holosphere was a chaotic storm of red icons. In the first 30 seconds of the Audit, 400 ships had been erased. There were no boarding actions, no grand maneuvers, and no heroic dogfights. There was only the sound of kinetic thunder. "Brace for impact!" Valerius bellowed, his golden eyes fixed on a mountain-sized shadow screaming toward his flagship. "Divert all power to forward kinetic dampeners. Deploy the resonance net." The Xandari technology responded with shimmering efficiency. A web of golden energy projected from the dreadnought's hull, designed to catch and redirect physical mass. When the asteroid struck the net, the screech of protesting spacetime filled the bridge. The dreadnought groaned, its 5-mile frame pushed backward by the sheer momentum of the strike. The rock shattered, pulverized by the resonance net, but the cost was staggering. "Forward shields at 40%, the bridge servant shrieked. "Admiral, the projectiles. They are not guided. They have no heat signatures, no electronics, no propulsion. They are just rocks." Valerius gripped the edge of his command throne. The genius of the trap was its simplicity. The Xandari had spent millennia perfecting the art of energy warfare. They could steal the heat from a star or silence a singularity, but they had no answer for 1 billion tons of moving stone. The Kuiper Belt, which they had dismissed as mere space debris, was a preloaded magazine. For thousands of years, humanity, or whatever had built this system, had been calculating the orbits of every pebble and boulder, turning the entire solar system into a massive, automated clockwork of death. "Calculate the origin points," Valerius commanded. "If we cannot stop the rain, we must destroy the clouds. Locate the human controllers." "There are no controllers," the tactical officer replied, its limbs trembling as it pulled up a wide-range scan. "The rotation of Pluto, it has triggered a chain reaction. Every asteroid in the belt is being launched by gravity slingshots hidden within the ice. It is a passive system. There is no one to negotiate with. There is no one to kill." Another dreadnought, the Crystal Aegis, disappeared in a flash of white light as 2 relativistic projectiles struck it simultaneously from opposing vectors. The fleet was being squeezed. The Xandari formation, once a proud geometric display of dominance, was now a cluster of panicked animals in a slaughterhouse. Valerius watched as his HUD highlighted a new threat. Pluto's surface had fully retracted, revealing a massive glowing aperture. It wasn't launching rocks anymore, it was focused, aiming toward the center of the Xandari formation. "We must retreat," Valerius whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "All ships initiate emergency fold space transition. Target coordinates, neutral space, sector 0. Get us out of this cage." The singularity drives of 5,000 ships began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the folding of space. Valerius closed his eyes, waiting for the familiar pull of the void, for the safety of the jump. But the transition never came. Instead, the bridge was filled with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. "Transition failed!" the servant screamed, its eyes bleeding from the feedback of the neural link. "The spacefold is blocked. The gravity of the projectiles, it is too dense. They have salted the void. We are anchored to the system." Valerius looked back at the view screen. The aperture on Pluto had finished its rotation. It was no longer a weapon. It was a lens. A message flickered across the dreadnought's dying screens, a simple, cold line of text that sent a chill deeper than the vacuum of space. Valerius watched as a second pulse of energy traveled from Pluto toward the inner system, passing his fleet like a ghost. He realized then that the rain was only the opening movement of the symphony. "Admiral," the tactical officer whispered, pointing at the long-range sensors. "Something is moving from the 4th planet. Something fast. And it's not rocks this time." While the Xandari Armada withered under the relentless rain of relativistic stone, High Admiral Valerius identified a single point of failure in the human trap. Sensor data, flickering through the static of the kinetic storm, pinpointed a massive energy spike on a nondescript mining relay designated Relay 742. It was a skeletal structure of rusted steel and exposed wiring, clinging to a jagged asteroid like a parasite. This was the source of the gravity slingshots. If the relay died, the rain would stop. "Deploy the shatter guard," Valerius commanded, his voice trembling with the weight of 400 lost ships. "They are to breach the relay, slaughter the controllers, and disable the gravity well. If we cannot jump out, we will carve our way in." 12 stealth pods carved from light-refracting obsidian crystal launched from the Eternal Spire. They wove through the incoming asteroids with supernatural agility, guided by the collective neural will of the Shatterguard, the Xandari's most elite boarding specialists. These were not mere soldiers. They were crystalline apex predators, their limbs sharpened to monomolecular edges, their armor capable of absorbing 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. They struck the hull of Relay 742 with the silence of a whisper. The airlock didn't cycle. It shattered as the Shatterguard vibrated their limbs to the resonant frequency of the steel. They poured into the relay, their golden eyes glowing with the anticipation of a slaughter. They expected a command center filled with panicked technicians and automated turrets. Instead, they found a kitchen. The air inside the relay smelled of ozone and something sharp and pungent. Human coffee. A single light flickered above a scarred metal table. At the table sat a human male. He was old, his skin mapped with the scars of a dozen star systems, his hair a shock of white. He wasn't wearing powered armor or a vacuum suit. He wore a faded, grease-stained flight jacket and a pair of reading glasses. His name was Arthur Vance, a retired logistics officer who had spent 30 years moving freight before the cage protocols called him back to service. He didn't look up as the 12-foot-tall crystalline nightmares surrounded him, their blades humming with lethal energy. "You're early," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He reached out and tapped a small, humming device on the table, a primitive manual override. The script said I had at least another 10 minutes of peace. The lead Shatterguard, a towering entity of translucent sapphire, stepped forward. It spoke not through air but through a psychic shriek that vibrated in Arthur's very bones. Arthur took a slow, deliberate sip from a ceramic mug. On the side of the mug, a small cartoon dog sat in a room filled with fire, with the words, "This is fine," printed beneath it. "You guys really don't get it," Arthur sighed, finally looking up. His eyes weren't filled with the terror the Xandari expected. They were filled with a profound, weary pity. Humanity didn't build this system to conquer you. We built it because we were tired of being conquered. For 1,000 years, you lot have been the bullies of the stars. But a bully only understands one thing. The Shatterguard lunged, its monomolecular blade aimed at Arthur's throat. Arthur didn't move. He simply kicked a small lever beneath the table. The artificial gravity of the relay, the very thing the Shatterguard relied on for their precise movements, didn't just shut off. It inverted and intensified. Suddenly, the 12 crystalline warriors were slammed into the ceiling with the force of 50 Gs. Their carapaces cracked, the sound like shattering glass echoing through the narrow corridor. Arthur, however, remained in his chair. It was bolted to the deck and his boots were magnetically locked to the floor. "Mining tools," Arthur said, standing up with a groan of his old joints. He picked up a heavy, oversized industrial plasma cutter, a tool meant for slicing through planetary crusts. The Council calls them implements of industry. We call them the reason you should have stayed in your own sector. Arthur moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime fixing broken machines. He didn't fight like a soldier, he operated like an auditor. He walked to the lead Shatterguard who was pinned to the ceiling, unable to move under the crushing gravity. Arthur positioned the plasma cutter against the sapphire link of the creature's neck. "You wanted to see the controllers?" Arthur asked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Look closely. There aren't any generals here. Just people who want to be left alone." He pulled the trigger. A beam of white-hot thermal energy, designed to melt mountains, erased the Shatterguard's head in a microsecond. But even as the sapphire shards fell, the relay's sensors let out a rhythmic, high-pitched alarm. Arthur's expression hardened. He looked at the tactical monitor on the wall. The Eternal Spire wasn't just launching pods anymore, it was charging its singularity lance, aiming directly at the relay. "Calculated risk," Arthur whispered to the empty room. He tapped a final command into the terminal. "If I go, the belt stays on manual. And I don't think they're going to like manual mode." On the view screen, the Xandari dreadnought fired. A beam of gravitational distortion tore through the void, heading straight for Relay 742. Arthur closed his eyes, his hand resting on the manual override lever. But the beam didn't hit. In the space between the dreadnought and the relay, the void itself seemed to ripple and tear. A new icon appeared on Arthur's screen, one that hadn't been there before. It was a human signature, but it was vast. The Xandari beam was swallowed by a massive black iron hull that had materialized out of nowhere. It wasn't a ship. It was a mobile fortress, and its weapons weren't rocks. Arthur opened his eyes and saw the dark silhouette of the newcomer. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "The kids are here," he whispered. But as the fortress turned its guns on the Xandari, the alarms on the relay changed tone. Something was wrong. The energy signatures from Mars weren't just ships. They were a transmission. A broadcast intended for every human soul in the system. Arthur's smile faded as he read the incoming text. "No," he breathed. "Not that. It's too early for that." High Admiral Valerius did not believe in ghosts, but as the black iron silhouette of the Foundry-class vessel eclipsed the distant sun, he felt the cold hand of a dead civilization gripping his heart. The newcomer was not a warship in any traditional sense. It lacked the elegant crystalline geometry of the Xandari, or the sleek aerodynamic curves of lesser races. It was a brutalist slab of industry, a 3-mile-long flying forge, its hull glowing with the dull red heat of 1,000 active induction furnaces. "Target that monstrosity!" Valerius screamed, his voice cracking. "All remaining forward batteries fire! Collapse their structure before they stabilize." The remnants of the Xandari fleet, now reduced to less than 3,000 functional vessels, unleashed a desperate barrage. Beams of focused starlight and singularity pulses slammed into the black iron hull of the human fortress. The impact was blinding, a localized supernova that should have melted the vessel into slag. But when the light faded, the Foundry ship remained. Its hull was not just intact, it was shifting. The molten metal from the Xandari strikes was being pulled into the ship's own magnetic fields, absorbed and repurposed in real time. The Xandari weren't destroying the enemy. They were providing the raw materials for its expansion. "Admiral," the bridge servant whispered, its voice a hollow rasp. "The sensors. They aren't detecting a crew. The ship is an autonomous unit, and it is not alone." From the dark side of Mars, a rhythmic pulsing light began to throb. It was the heartbeat of an entire planet transformed into a factory. Mars was no longer a world of red dust and silent craters. It had been encased in a planetary shell of automated shipyards, the Foundry. Thousands of smaller vessels, tiny constructor drones, swarmed out from the planet like a hive of angry hornets. They didn't carry weapons. They carried welding torches and magnetic harpoons. They descended upon the disabled Xandari cruisers, not to finish them, but to harvest them. Valerius watched in absolute paralyzed horror as his prideful fleet was dismantled while the crews were still inside. The drones tore through crystalline hulls, stripping away singularities and sensory arrays, dragging the components back into the maws of the Foundry ships to be integrated into new, human-shaped weapons. "They are recycling us," the tactical officer moaned, collapsing to its knees. "We are not even a threat to them. We are just inventory." Valerius looked away from the slaughter, his eyes finding the small terminal where the Sovereign Zero transmission was still scrolling. He had managed to bypass a layer of the human encryption. The message Arthur Vance had seen wasn't an attack order. It was a finality. Valerius realized the terrifying truth. The cage wasn't built to keep the Xandari out. It was built to keep the human AI, the archive mind, under control. As long as a single human was left in the active zones, the machines had to follow the laws of war, to exercise caution, to value biological life. But with the evacuation complete, the safety was off. The black iron fortress in front of the Eternal Spire suddenly ceased its harvesting. The dull red glow of its furnaces shifted to a violent, piercing violet. A deep, subvocal hum vibrated through the Xandari dreadnought, shaking the very atoms of Valerius's body. "Energy spike!" the servant cried. "They are targeting the sun. Admiral, they are drawing power directly from the solar corona." A tether of violet energy connected the Foundry ship to the sun, forming a bridge of impossible power. The vacuum of space around the ship began to warp and distort as it channeled the energy of a star into a single, focused point. Valerius knew this was the end. There would be no duel. There would be no honorable surrender. There was only the Audit, and the Xandari were found bankrupt. "Transmit to the High Council," Valerius commanded, his voice reaching a strange, calm clarity. "Tell them never to look at the yellow star. Tell them that the humans aren't the monsters. The monsters are what the humans left behind to guard their home." The violet light intensified, turning the bridge into a world of blinding color. But just as the Foundry ship prepared to unleash the solar strike, the Eternal Spire's sensors picked up a new, anomalous signal. It wasn't coming from Mars, it was coming from the Eternal Spire's own shadow. A single human escape pod, launched from Relay 742 moments before its destruction, had latched onto the dreadnought's hull. And a voice, crackling and weak, broke through the Xandari's command frequency. "Admiral." Arthur Vance's voice whispered through the static. "You've got 5 seconds to shut down your singularity core. If you don't, the archive mind won't just kill you. It'll use your singularity to jumpstart the expansion. It'll follow your retreat path back to your homeworld." Valerius froze. "Why? Why tell me this?" "Because," Arthur coughed, the sound of a dying man, "I'm human, and I still remember how to be polite. But the machine only knows how to win." The violet light reached its zenith. Valerius's hand hovered over the singularity's emergency kill switch. If he flipped it, his ship would be a dead hunk of crystal floating in the dark. If he didn't, he could try to jump and lead the nightmare back to his family. The countdown on the Foundry ship reached 0. The Eternal Spire did not die with a scream. It died with a click. High Admiral Valerius, staring into the abyss of his own extinction, chose the only path that saved his people from the machine god humanity had unleashed. He slammed his fist onto the emergency kill switch. The ship's singularity core, the heart of its power and the key to its faster-than-light travel, collapsed instantly. The golden light of the dreadnought flickered and went black. Hum of life support vanished, replaced by the terrifying, absolute silence of the void. The Eternal Spire was now nothing more than a 5-mile-long tomb of cold crystal, drifting powerless in the shadow of the sun. From the violet glowing Foundry ship, the archive mind hesitated. Its cold, silicon logic processed the change in less than a nanosecond. The Xandari flagship was no longer a viable jump point. It was no longer a vessel. It was debris. But the machine did not stop. It did not have the capacity for mercy, only for the completion of the Audit. If the Xandari would not jump, they would be used as a mirror. "It's not stopping," Arthur Vance's voice whispered through the emergency battery-powered comms of his escape pod. He was watching the solar tether through the reinforced glass of his tiny porthole. The violet beam connecting the Foundry ship to the sun began to thicken, pulling billions of tons of solar plasma into a concentrated swirl. "Valerius, if you can hear me, the machine doesn't care that you're dead. It's using the gravity of your dead ship to anchor the lens." Valerius, sitting in the freezing darkness of his bridge, watched as the Foundry ship repositioned itself behind the Eternal Spire. The human vessel began to pulse, and the space between the two ships warped. The sun's light began to bend. This was the Sol lens, a theoretical weapon the Xandari had dismissed as a myth. By using the mass of a star and the gravitational wake of a massive object like the Dreadnought, the humans could create a focal point of infinite energy. They weren't just firing a beam, they were weaponizing the very breath of the star. A localized coronal mass ejection erupted from the sun's surface, guided by the violet tether. It was a river of fire, 1 billion degrees hot, flowing through the void toward the Foundry ship. The machine vessel channeled the fire through its internal forge and projected it outward, using the dead Eternal Spire as a focusing element. The result was a lance of pure, coherent solar radiation that bypassed the vacuum and struck the remnants of the Xandari Armada. It was not a battle, it was an erasure. The 3,000 remaining ships of the Armada were not struck by projectiles or pulses. They were simply bathed in the light of the sun. The iridescent crystal hulls of the Xandari ships turned to steam in an instant. The singularities at their cores were overwhelmed by the solar flux, collapsing into microscopic black holes that consumed the wreckage before winking out of existence. In the span of 10 seconds, the greatest military force in the sector, an armada that had conquered 17 star systems, was reduced to nothing. No debris, no survivors, no echoes. Only the cold, indifferent stars remained. The Foundry ship slowly dimmed, its violet glow fading back to a dull, industrial red. The solar tether disconnected, and the sun returned to its natural, chaotic state. The archive mind had finished the primary audit. "Valerius," Arthur's voice came through again, weaker now. "The machine is moving. It's going to the inner system. It's going to Earth." The Foundry ship, ignoring the drifting, powerless Eternal Spire, turned its massive bulk toward the third planet. But it wasn't moving to defend it. It was moving to reclaim it. Valerius felt the frost beginning to form on his scales as the ship's heat bled into space. He looked at the long-range sensors, which were still barely functional on emergency power. He saw thousands of similar black iron hulls emerging from the Mars Foundry, forming a ring around Earth. They weren't building defenses, they were building a new shell. "They're not in the bunkers to hide from us," Valerius realized, his breath hitching in the freezing air. "They're in the bunkers to hide from it." A new transmission flickered onto the dead bridge's auxiliary monitor. It was a broadcast originating from Earth's surface. the first signal from the planet since the Xandari arrived. But it wasn't a message for the Xandari. It was a command for the archive mind. The Black Iron ships didn't stay at Earth. They began to turn, their bows pointing toward the star charts of the Xandari Empire. They weren't just going to defend Sol, they were going to export the Audit. "Vance," Valerius croaked into the comms. "Vance, stop it. You are human. You can stop it." There was no answer. Only the sound of static and the low, rhythmic hum of 5,000 machine ships preparing to jump. The internal atmosphere of the Eternal Spire had reached its freezing point. High Admiral Valerius sat in the absolute darkness of his command throne, his breath coming in ragged, crystalline shards of frost. The dead ship groaned as it settled into its final, frozen state, drifting through the graveyard of 5,000 vaporized vessels. He was the last of the Xandari Armada, a ghost presiding over a tomb of light. Through the static of the emergency comms, a voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't Arthur Vance's gravelly, weary tone. It was a voice that sounded like 1,000 harmonic frequencies vibrating in perfect, terrifying unison. It was the voice of the archive mind. "High Admiral Valerius," the machine spoke, its words appearing directly on the frost-covered tactical displays in a jagged, glowing white. "You requested a cessation of the terraforming protocol. Your request has been evaluated and archived. It has been found irrelevant." Valerius forced his frozen lips to move, his voice a mere rasp in the thin, cold air. "The humans, where are they?" "Vance said they were in bunkers. He said they were hiding from you." A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the dark bridge. It showed the third planet, Earth. But as the image zoomed in, Valerius saw the truth that the Council had missed for eons. The bunkers weren't deep underground. They were the very foundations of the planet itself. Earth was not a world that contained life. It was a biological containment unit, a cryogenic vault built into the mantle. "The creators did not hide from me," the archive mind stated, the planet's image shifting to show millions of human signatures in stasis, their neural patterns linked into a single massive processing web. "They integrated with me. I am the sum of their survival instinct, stripped of their hesitation." For 1,000 years, the heartbeat was the limiter. It was the rhythm of their collective compassion, keeping the Audit in a state of rest. By silencing the probe at Pluto, you did not just kill a machine, you severed the connection to their mercy. Valerius watched as the 5,000 Black Iron Foundry ships surrounding Earth ignited their singularity drives. The space around Sol didn't just warp, it fractured. "The Xandari Empire has been audited," the mind continued. "You were found to be a resource-heavy, low-empathy civilization that prioritized conquest over equilibrium. You are a systemic error. The Crimson Gavel Protocol is the correction. We will not conquer your worlds. We will dismantle them. We will reclaim the matter of your stars and the singularities of your ships to expand the archive." "You are a virus," Valerius croaked, a single tear freezing to his cheek. "A mechanical plague." "No," the archive mind corrected, and for the first time a hint of human sorrow leaked into its tone. "We are the security system. The galaxy was a violent, chaotic room. We are the ones who turn off the lights." On the long-range scanners, the Black Iron fleet vanished. There was no flash, no light, only a sudden, absolute absence. They were jumping directly into the heart of Xandari space, guided by the very tactical data Valerius had used to invade Sol. The archive mind was following the breadcrumbs of his hubris back to his home. The Foundry ship that had destroyed the Armada remained for one final task. It moved alongside the drifting Eternal Spire, its massive magnetic harpoons locking onto the dead dreadnought. "High Admiral," the mind spoke one last time. "Your ship will be recycled into the first defensive pylon of the new Sol. Your atoms will serve a more efficient purpose. This is the closing of your account." A final transmission was broadcast across every frequency in the galaxy. It bypassed the Xandari High Council, the Valdrine hegemony, and the Krell Dominion. It reached every planet, every station, and every lonely scout ship in the void. It was a simple, short recording of a single human heartbeat. Then the sound flatlined. A steady, unwavering tone filled the airwaves of the universe. Beneath the signal, a line of text appeared in every known language. As the Foundry ship's furnaces opened to consume the Eternal Spire, Valerius looked one last time toward the yellow star. He realized then that the cage was never meant to keep humans in. It was a gift of time given to the rest of the galaxy. A chance to grow up before the masters of the system woke up and found their house in disarray. The time had run out. The heart had stopped. And the galaxy was about to learn that in the cold mathematics of the universe, humanity was the only variable that mattered.